Our next panel, or our next speaker, I should say, is Kathleen Duvall. She teaches early American history and American Indian history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In addition to her award-winning books, The Native Ground, Indian and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent, and Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, she is also co-editor of Interpreting a Continent, Voices from Colonial America. At present, she is a faculty fellow at UNC's Institute for Art and Humanities and an elected fellow for the American Antiquarian Society. Please welcome Dr. Kathleen Duvall.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Let me see if I can. No? Oh, yeah, there we go. Thank you for hosting us today, making all of us feel so welcome here, and thanks to all the rest of the program committee as well, especially Emily Clark for bringing the speakers here, and Elizabeth Ogden. I don't know if she's in here, but she's been great. In January 1777, Oliver Pollock was in the Cabildo, waiting to meet the new governor of Louisiana. He was nervous. Now, Oliver Pollock wasn't usually nervous. He was a very successful New Orleans merchant, and he usually got along with governors. Now, at this point in Louisiana's history, 1777, the governors were Spanish. At the end of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, France lost that war and surrendered the entire colony of Louisiana. The first round of French Louisiana, which ended with the 7 Years' War, Louisiana was both sides of the Mississippi. So basically the entire Mississippi Valley from the Gulf to Canada, and from the Rockies really to the Appalachians. France lost the war, surrendered the eastern half of Louisiana to the British, who won the French and Indian War, and gave the western half to Spain, its ally in the war, along with New Orleans. Now, those are European claims. You can see from the map, if you can see the slightly smaller print on there, you can see all over that map are Native American nations who actually lived on and controlled that land. But what that sets up by 1777 is the Mississippi River is the border between the gigantic Spanish Empire, which stretches from Tierra del Fuego up to here, right? And the gigantic British Empire, which extends from, it isn't only the 13 colonies that will end up rebelling, but is about probably twice that many colonies from the Canadian colonies down through the West Indies in North America. Some French New Orleans merchants had difficulty working with Spanish governors, but Pollock had done very well under Spanish rule. Pollock was Irish, and he had managed to attract the patronage of the Irish-born Spanish governor Alejandro O'Reilly in the 1760s. Governor O'Reilly had allowed Pollock to trade between New Orleans and Havana and had exempted him from the usual trade regulations that merchants were under trying to trade there. Still, Pollock sensed that the current governor, O'Reilly's successor, a man named Luis de Unzaga de Amenzaga, had come to dread seeing him. Protests in Boston, you may have heard, had grown into a revolution against an empire, against the British Empire. And Oliver Pollock truly believed that Spain should assist that fight, should fight Britain alongside the rebels that would become the United States. Pollock went to visit Governor Unzaga over and over and over, trying to get him to help the rebels, trying to get him to basically enter into a war, help one side in a war that Spain was not involved in yet. But now Unzaga had been promoted to Captain General of Venezuela, and Pollock hoped for a new start and a better relationship with the incoming governor, a young man named Bernardo de Galvez. To Pollock's delight that January of 1777, Governor Galvez greeted him enthusiastically. He asked Pollock lots of questions about this General Washington and his army. And as Pollock later wrote, he gave me the delightful assurance that he would go to every possible length for the interest of Congress. Now, New Orleans was and is about 1,500 miles from Boston and about 2,000 miles from Mexico City, so it was far from the American Revolution and on the far edge of the Spanish Empire. But in 1777, as I said, New Orleans was on the border of these two giant empires. Right across that border, the British colony that became British right after the 7 Years' War was called West Florida. And West Florida, as well as East Florida, basically the state of Florida today, they were both British colonies at the time of the Revolution, but they did not rebel. They stayed loyal to the crown. So New Orleans would become strategically important as the American Revolution drew in the empires of Europe. Spanish officials like Bernardo de Galvez saw the American Revolution as their chance to push back on Britain's victories from the 7 Years' War and to expand themselves, to expand Spain's empire further into North America. Now, of course, sponsoring a rebellion against an empire when you have your own empire may not seem like the natural choice for a king. But the Spanish assumed they would be able to control these rebels, these people trying to leave the British Empire. They didn't really know that much about them. Spain's ambassador to France suggested, "These Americans, many being Quakers, will be gentler neighbors than Britain." He really didn't know much about Americans. Now, Spain's problem, if it was going to fight Britain, take advantage of this rebellion and fight Britain again, on this far northern border. Spain's problem was that almost no one here actually was Spanish. In 1777, a lot of other people called New Orleans home. Recently arrived French Acadians who had fled the British during the 7 Years' War, had fled Canada. There were French colonists, of course, whose families had been here for generations. Some of whom had not all that recently themselves rebelled against the Spanish Empire, or at least talked a lot about rebelling against the Spanish Empire in the New Orleans Revolt of 1768. There were free and enslaved people of African descent, and there were a large number of different Native American nations that we heard about yesterday in Dan Usner's talk. Homas and Tunicas, Biloxis and Chitimacha, Tunicas and Pascagoula, farther north, Caddos and Choctaws, Quapaws and Osage. Anybody who wanted to lead these people into war would have to appeal to their interests, which were not the same as each other. They would have to convince all of these different people that they should fight for Spain. Bernardo de Galvez was the right man for the job. He was a man of the Enlightenment. He was committed to running a well-organized and efficient empire, not always the memory that people have of the Spanish Empire, but this was, many Spanish officials felt like a new day for the Spanish Empire. His uncle was Spain's Minister of the Indies, so he had connections. And although Spain technically was neutral still in 1777, Governor Galvez did what he could against Britain. Now, previously, official Spanish policy had said that only Spanish ships could do business at the port of New Orleans. But in fact, lots of illegal trade, illegal British trade happened there, the kind of thing that we heard from Shannon Dottie about yesterday. In fact, some people called the Mississippi a floating marketplace. So it was far from being a tight border. It was a place you could just go to buy stuff from the other side. Galvez officially allowed American and French traders to do business in New Orleans, and he started cracking down on British trade. He began seizing British ships that his men found on the lower Mississippi. Now, if you sort of think about the geography of the lower Mississippi, any crops that British plantations were producing, if they came down the Mississippi, they would have to not continue past the border into Spanish Louisiana and to New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi. Instead, they needed to go, sort of take that left turn on the Iberville River and go out through Lake Maurepas and Lake Pontchartrain, a considerably less desirable route than going out the Mississippi. Oliver Pollock delightedly reported to Congress, "The port of New Orleans is open and free to American commerce and to the admission and sale of prizes made by their cruisers." Basically, if any Americans out there grab somebody else's ship, grab a British ship, they can come in and sell it and its stuff in New Orleans. Come on in. Pollock wrote to Congress a lot. He gathered information on the British strength in Pensacola, whether it was attackable, how likely the British were to attack from there. With the secret support of the Spanish crown, Pollock and Galvez sent $70,000 worth of munitions to the American commander of Fort Pitt. In recognition for his service, Congress named Pollock Congress's agent in His Most Catholic Majesty's province of Louisiana. Now, at the same time that Pollock was doing this work, Galvez was working to encourage Louisianans' loyalty to Spain in case Spain joined the war. Galvez knew he would need a strong militia. He knew that Spain would be fighting on many different fronts, and even if his New Orleans became part of the war, there wouldn't be many regular troops sent to him. Now, one of the first things that Galvez discovered was that most of New Orleans' upper-class-men declined to serve in the militia because, as Galvez wrote to his uncle, because they do not want to serve in formations next to their own shoemakers and hairdressers. So Galvez plays to them. He established an elite cavalry order, the Carabineros de la Louisiana, gave them fancy uniforms, different from the regular militia uniforms, gilt buttons, gold thread buttonholes, matching sabers. At the same time, Galvez increased the size of the New Orleans Free Black and Pardo, which is the mixed race militias, and they got fancy new uniforms too. And of course, Emily Clark can tell us lots more than I can about the Free Black militia in New Orleans. Galvez created ties of family and patronage within the New Orleans community. He married the daughter of a prominent New Orleans family, Marie-Felice de Saint-Maxent. Now, the Maxents were a prominent merchant and planter family with connections in ports beyond New Orleans, and also with Indians west of St. Louis. They were very active in the fur trade. And they were no strangers to marrying Spanish governors. Marie-Felice's sister had married the previous governor, Unzaga, and was on her way to Venezuela. The Acadians were one group in Louisiana who did not need persuading to support Spain or anybody in a war against Britain. They hated the British, and they had come to see the Spanish as their protectors, as the people who'd given them refuge. The Acadians only had to cast their eyes across to West Florida to remember what they needed protection against: the British, who had thrown them out of their homeland, and still seemed to threaten them in New Orleans. Now, soon people on the British side of the border were talking about Galvez and his somewhat secret efforts. One British West Floridian from Pensacola wrote in October 1777 about the rumors of the new governor's arrival. You'll hear here the typical English stereotype about New Orleans, right? Just about this new Spanish governor. His name is Galvez, nephew to the Spanish minister for the Department of the Indies. He is gay, young, and courteous, and he enters into all the New Orleans parties of pleasure and amusements, and professes what really seems to be natural to him, an evident partiality for the French nation. Now the gay, volatile inhabitants of Louisiana have got their every wish. Their trade is opened, and even their very foibles countenanced by their new governor, in return for which they almost pay him adoration. Insomuch that in the event of a war between our crown and theirs, Britain and Spain, it's generally believed that it would take thousands, where hundreds only would have been necessary before his arrival, to take New Orleans. So basically, if Britain now tried to take New Orleans, which Britain certainly was thinking about as part of its war aims, it would take thousands of men instead of hundreds of men to take it, at a time when maybe the French of New Orleans would be like, whatever, the British, the Spanish, either one's fine. Or we hate them both. At the same time, Galvez recruited Indian allies. He met in New Orleans with smaller Indian nations of the lower Mississippi Valley, including Attakapas, Biloxis, Chitimaches, Natchitoches, Appaloosas, and Pascagoula. Huge delegations of Creeks and Choctaws came to New Orleans. And Galvez spent a lot of money hosting them in New Orleans and then sending them back home with supplies and presents for their families and friends. And he had to write his superiors to explain why he was spending all this money. And Galvez wrote, "The generosity distributed on behalf of His Majesty has caused a lot of admiration. And in recognition of that, they have offered to stay loyal." So he's hoping he's buying their loyalty. In July 1777, George Morgan made a proposal to Congress. He proposed that Congress work with Louisiana Governor Bernardo de Galvez and try to take West Florida from the British. Morgan's plan was, we send one force down the Mississippi River, and we meet it from the Gulf with American ships. Morgan offered he could coordinate with Oliver Pollock. Pollock was actually Morgan's own agent in New Orleans for trying to do business in New Orleans. After Congress heard Morgan's proposal, John Adams and Samuel Adams and other members of the Board of War, basically a committee of Congress, officially recommended that the Congress fund 1,000 men to be led by Continental Army General Edward Hand and supported by Spanish artillery, supplies, and ships. Congress debated. On the pro side, representatives including Pennsylvania Congressman Robert Morris said, there are so many things we can achieve by sending a force down the Mississippi and trying to take West Florida from the British. He said, we'll destroy British trade on the Mississippi, we can seize British goods and make money off of that, sell them in New Orleans. Opening another front will draw British attention away from the fight in the 13 colonies. We can damage Britain's connection with Indians by revealing to Indians that the British are vulnerable. And best of all, we can make West Florida the 14th state in the American Union. Other congressmen thought this sounded a little bit crazy. They said, you know, our biggest problem in Congress is we don't have enough men and supplies to fight the battles we're already fighting. If we did take West Florida, how would we manage to hold it? We don't have an occupying force, certainly. They said, don't be so sure that the loyal British citizens, subjects of West Florida won't fight us to stay British. Some of them were actually refugees from the 13 colonies who'd gone to West Florida because it hadn't joined the Revolution. They said, don't forget those fevers of the South that Northerners are always worried about. They said, Britain's Indian allies, you think we're going to impress them? They're just going to fight against us. That's a reason on the con side. And they said, what if the British or the Creek Indians decide in revenge for this attack from the Mississippi, they come east and attack plantations in South Carolina and Georgia and persuade slaves there to rise up against their masters? And as you can imagine, the congressmen who made that argument the loudest were slave-owning, plantation-owning congressmen from Georgia and South Carolina. Congress voted down Morgan's proposal to send a force down the Mississippi River. But a few congressmen still thought it was a good idea. Congressman Robert Morris of Pennsylvania and William Smith of Maryland, with no official sanction, this had been voted down, right? Approached a man who they thought might listen to a shady offer. They couldn't go to General Hand, right? He's a real general in the Continental Army, such as it is. But this man, James Willing, seemed more interested. James Willing had connections in New Orleans and in Philadelphia. He was the younger brother in a prominent family, which included some mayors of Philadelphia. His older brother, Thomas, was a partner in Robert Morris's mercantile firm, Willing and Morris, all tied together. And a few years before, Thomas Willing, the big brother, had helped his younger brother, James, establish a dry goods store north of Baton Rouge in partnership with Oliver Pollock. So at this point, Baton Rouge was in West Florida, so it's actually British. So Pollock is doing business across the Mississippi River by having James Willing there. But by this point, James Willing, as the war began, as the revolution began, Willing tried to urge his neighbors in Baton Rouge to join the rebellion, to rise up against the British, to make West Florida part of the revolution. But Willing was not a particularly successful businessman, and his neighbors reported that his biggest talk about the revolution was when he was deep in drink, which was a pretty common occurrence with James Willing. For some reason, these two congressmen were more impressed with James Willing than his Baton Rouge neighbors had been, and they commissioned him secretly as a captain in the Navy and gave him secret orders to go down the Mississippi, pick off vulnerable British forts, claim them for the United States, seize Loyalist property in the name of the United States, arrive at New Orleans, sell that property, and ask Galvez and Pollock for support. Carried swiftly by the Mississippi's high late winter waters, Willing's gunboat, the Rattletrap, floated down the Ohio River from Fort Pitt and then down the Mississippi. He and his, not 1,000 men, he and his 40 men surprised the British posts of Natchez and Manchac. They took down each fort's Union Jack and put up their own kind of handmade stars and stripes. They also attacked private homes and farms on the British side of the river, surprising inhabitants, capturing slaves from plantations, and seizing any property they could carry off. Now, by this point, Galvez and Pollock had heard the initial proposal, the 1,000 men, the big coordinated possible plan, but they soon heard that something was happening that was quite different from that. British refugees from West Florida started streaming into New Orleans, Spanish New Orleans, as a place of refuge. And they brought with them horrific tales of Willing's small group of basically just marauders. One of the many things that Willing had taken was a 16-gun schooner, the Rebecca, which had been anchored just off of British Manchac, being loaded loaded for London. In March, Willing sailed the Rebecca across Lake Pontchartrain and made his triumphant entrance into New Orleans. If Pollock and Galvez expected a ship-shape officer with well-trained troops, they were disappointed. Willing's scruffy few dozen men had no uniforms, but were heavily armed, and they were jealously guarding their plunder, which they were, of course, going to sell in New Orleans. They had the dozens of men and women whom they had stolen from their plantations. They had them carry into New Orleans cask after cask of blue indigo powder from the plantations, logs ready for the lumber mill, bundles of furs and hides, and blankets full of an assortment of West Floridians' stuff, silverware, clothes, bed and table linens, food and wine, and a lot of empty wine bottles. Oliver Pollock wrote pointedly to Congress on July 6th, "The small party you have sent here under the command of Captain James Willing without any order or subordination has only thrown the whole river into confusion and created a number of enemies and a heavy expense." And now Willing didn't seem eager to leave the comforts of New Orleans, like many of us. He stayed on for months as the land he had supposedly seized in the name of the United States went right back into British hands. Pollock eventually paid Willing's way home, got him onto a ship and sent him off. As Willing got on board, he handed to Pollock another stack of bills of expenses he'd racked up in New Orleans. His ship was actually captured off the coast of Delaware, and he was put in prison in New York, so a little bit of ha-ha. Oliver and his wife, Margaret Pollock, began to see their family's finances suffer for supporting the revolution. Oliver Pollock borrowed money from other New Orleans merchants, and he got government loans, Spanish government loans from Galvez, eventually totaling $74,000, which is well over $1 million today. But they all hoped this war would pay off in the end. In 1778, French King Louis XVI declared war on Britain and signed a treaty of alliance with the American rebels. Now, in theory, the existing alliance between Spain and France would also have pulled King Carlos III of Spain into this war. But France had to persuade the Spanish king. France promised that the war would return Gibraltar to Spain. Gibraltar is the very tip of the Iberian Peninsula that actually belongs to Britain and irritates Spain to this day, being right next to it. But the war was supposed to, I guess there was a spoiler on that one, supposed to return Gibraltar to Spain and give Spain West Florida and East Florida. So, in June 1779, Spanish King Carlos III declared war on Britain. The king wanted General Galvez to take quick action from New Orleans. He was to attack British posts on the Mississippi, and then Mobile and Pensacola. Pensacola was the capital of British West Florida. The king ordered the governor of Cuba to assist Galvez with land and sea forces. And the crown's letter to Cuba's governor, telling him to send this help, explained how New Orleans and the Gulf Coast were vital to Spain's new war to restore and extend its empire. As the letter said, "The king has decided that the principal objective of his arms in America during the war with the English is to drive them from the Gulf of Mexico and the banks of the Mississippi, where their settlements are so prejudicial to our commerce, as well as to the security of our richest possession," which was Mexico. Britain, the letter goes on, "Britain, pressed by superior forces in both hemispheres, abandoned by other nations, who for a long time have been irritated by her odious dominance, and on the point of having her own island, Britain, her own island invaded by a French army of more than 40,000 men." At this point, the France and Spain are planning to invade Britain itself, which they almost do if it hadn't been for a storm. But that's another story. Britain will find herself unable to resist our efforts if we act with prudence and energy. So this is, the Gulf Coast and New Orleans are a part of the aims of the war and the way the war will go. Spain's declaration of war sparked a debate in the House of Commons and among George III's advisors over whether maybe at this point they should just let the 13 rebelling colonies go, because now that France and Spain had joined, they were in danger of losing much, much more than 13 not so valuable colonies. But the king believed that granting rebellious colonies their independence would only encourage other colonies to follow their example. He figured it's best to nip this rebellion in the bud. Now, for French, Spanish, and even for British officials, the revolution was really just the spark that ignited this world war. The real war to them was the one now lining up, involving Europe, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, and India. In fact, imperial correspondents tended to refer to the war as things like this, the war between France and England, making no reference to the rebelling colonies and not calling it the American Revolution at all. To European officials, the war would either restore the French and Spanish to their previous imperial dominance or solidify British dominance over the North Atlantic and most of North America. However, 2 months after Carlos III made up his mind, on August 18, 1779, the affairs of the world seemed unimportant in New Orleans. Its people, this is appropriate, its people watched heavy storm clouds gather over the Gulf as the wind grew stronger. Now, there's no radar, no TV news in this era. They had to judge a storm by sight and feel and sound. But it soon became clear that this was a hurricane. Having circulated in the Gulf for days, it grew to hundreds of miles across, with winds of over 100 miles an hour. That schooner Rebecca, the one that Willing had sailed in and then sold, of course, was on the lower Mississippi as the hurricane hit. The crew could only try to stay above the water as the waves and high winds smashed the ship to pieces. 11 men drowned while the rest clung to what was left of the ship until rescue boats picked them up, frightened and waterlogged. In less than 3 hours, the hurricane demolished houses in New Orleans and the surrounding countryside, destroyed the harvest, killed livestock, and left the city, in the words of Galvez's report, the most pitiful spectacle imaginable. I don't think you have to imagine it, though. Even before the hurricane, Galvez had been worried that the people of Louisiana wouldn't follow him into battle. But there were British partisans, he was worried they wouldn't follow him to battle. He also knew there were British partisans living in New Orleans who, as soon as he said anything about the war or seemed to be doing anything to prepare for a fight, would immediately tell the people of West Florida and make surprise attack impossible. So Galvez had kept the news of the king's declaration of war, the Spanish king's declaration of war, a secret. While he sent orders to his commandants out in the smaller posts, telling them to send him lists of male inhabitants who would be eligible for service just in case the war came. And as secretly as he could, he had been trying to improve New Orleans' defenses and getting some vessels together that he could use to transport troops. He'd invited Choctaws and Chickasaws and other Indians to New Orleans to urge them either to fight on the side of the Spanish or at least to stay home and not fight on the side of the British, if war came. But then the hurricane came. New Orleans lost the ships, not only the ships that were supposed to transport troops, but the ships that were supposed to protect it. And of course, its people were focused on repairing the city. The reinforcements, as expected from Havana for this war, were damaged and delayed. And with the capriciousness of hurricanes, British West Florida hadn't been affected at all. It wasn't clear that Galvez was going to be able to inspire the people of New Orleans to abandon their cleanup efforts to work and fight for the glory of Spain. So Galvez got to work on a speech. 2 days after the hurricane, Galvez stood in front of the Cabildo and spoke to the discouraged inhabitants of New Orleans in the Place d'Armes, or the Plaza de Armas, obviously not called Jackson Square. He decided to tell only half the truth. He announced that Spain had recognized the independence of the United States, but he said, there is still peace, and Spain wants to keep the peace as long as England doesn't break it. That's not true at all, right? New Orleans, though, was in danger, he said, because the British might start hostilities with us just as they had with the French. So he brings in the French, right? You remember Spain and France are on the same side of this, right? French people of New Orleans. Galvez also told him that the mail had brought him news that the king had given him, promoted him to brigadier general. But he says, in front of the crowd, in front of the Cabildo, he says, to accept the king's promotion, I would have to take an oath to defend Louisiana. But he says, I'm not sure in good conscience I can take that oath. And the people are, what does he mean? Doesn't he love his king? He says, no, that's not the problem. I would shed the last drop of my blood in sacrifice for my sovereign. But then he explained where his problem was. Where he balked was that in swearing to defend Louisiana, given the unfortunate state of the colony with the few troops that I have, he says, this would surely be a hollow oath unless the people of Louisiana promise me to fulfill it. They totally took the bait. A huge cry lets out, yes, we'll follow you, Governor. They showered him with compliments, and then as he wrote to his uncle, they almost carried me in their arms into the Cabildo, forcing open the doors without waiting for the keys. Inside, he said, they hailed me with the greatest acclamations of joy and promised me they would sacrifice their lives in service to the king and do the same with their property. So, as a result, a mere 8 days after the hurricane, Margaret Pollock and Marie-Felice de Saint-Maxent bid adieu to their husbands as they rode out of the city to recruit more followers in the Acadian and American Indian communities northwest of New Orleans. Now, leaders of the American Revolution were thrilled that Spain had joined the war. Thomas Jefferson, newly elected governor of Virginia, wrote, Spain's declaration has given us all the certainty of a happy issue to the present contest, of which human events will admit. And in the same letter, Jefferson goes on, and he asks Galvez for a loan. Could you please send Virginia $65,000 to buy supplies for the war effort? Not to be left out, Congress passed a resolution. Given the distressed state of our finances and the great depreciation of our paper money, we hope the Spanish king will be induced to lend us $5 million. It was soon clear that Spanish and American expectations of this war did not line up. Galvez wrote Jefferson back. He reminded him, Spain is engaged in a costly war, and Louisiana is one of our most exposed provinces, having the enemy at our doors. The immense and innumerable expenses occasioned to the crown in this country do not permit me to make the slightest advance of money. Spain and the United States even couldn't really agree on a treaty. The relationship did not go that well. But back in New Orleans, Galvez and his force marched and rode out of the city. By the time they reached British territory, a majority of Galvez's force was militia, thanks to his inspiring speeches in New Orleans and as they went on their way. Militiamen could easily refuse to fight. George Washington was learning this lesson very well. He had to very carefully manage his militia. Galvez wrote his uncle, I am certain of their goodwill, but your excellency knows very well that one cannot count on them, because as war is not their profession, they do not wage it with enthusiasm, and always have in mind, in view of the danger, the consideration of their families. They might fight for their families, but they're going to be worried about their families when they're away from home. But Galvez had managed to persuade diverse men and women that Spain's fight was their fight. In the morning of September 7th, 1779, the sun hadn't risen yet as the men gathered just south of the Iberville River, on the border, which was the border, as I said, between Louisiana and West Florida. It was a suspiciously big crowd. There were about 1,300 armed men, French-speaking Louisianans, both Acadians and those whose families had been here longer. Some of the militiamen were British refugees who hadn't gone back to West Florida. At least 80 members of the Free Black Militia were there, about 160 Homas, 6 towns Choctaws, Alabamas, and other Indians of the lower Mississippi River. 7 Americans, including Oliver Pollock. But all that most of them knew was that Spain had recognized the United States as an independent country, and that Britain might retaliate against Spanish Louisiana. But from his horse, Galvez told them the startling news. King Carlos III had not simply recognized the independence of the United States, he declared war on Britain, and he expected the people of Louisiana to do their part. The Spanish forces took British Manchac after light resistance. It was a pretty easy conquest because the British commander, Alexander Dixon, had evacuated most of his forces and artillery to Baton Rouge. So Galvez marched his forces toward Baton Rouge. They set up camp about a mile and a half away. Now, Dixon had chosen a good place to make his stand at Baton Rouge. Spanish scouts reported that the tall earthen fort was protected by a ditch 18 feet wide and 9 feet deep and a stockade of sharp vertical stakes. And Galvez knew he did not have enough provisions for a long siege and that he might lose his militia force if things took so long. So he sort of scouted out the most advantageous place from which to establish the kind of trench where they could put Spanish artillery behind. And he sent to that place where the forest sort of came closest to the fort a detachment of Alabamas, other Indians, and white and black militia. And basically their orders were to look busy. So they chopped, they dug some holes, they occasionally fired a gun, because they were the decoys. On the other side of the fort, in a only slightly less advantageous place, enslaved laborers were digging the real trenches. They built up dirt to form a protective parapet. They carried in the wooden platforms to position their artillery on. And when the British in the fort at Baton Rouge finally realized there was something going on there, it was too late to turn their artillery on them. Galvez ordered his artillery to open fire, and after 3.5 hours, the fort was in such bad shape that Dixon surrendered. The Briton, Dixon, surrendered to the Spaniard Galvez in their only common language, French. Dixon agreed to evacuate the fort at Natchez as well because it was completely cut off at that point. General Galvez wrote his superiors, "The militias have done the most. The Acadians particularly," he wrote, "remembered the past war and the damages and cruelties that the English inflicted upon them, and for which reason they abandoned their land." He equally praised New Orleans Free Black militias for taking part, he wrote, "in every advance, sham attack, and scout mission, always shooting at the enemy and bearing themselves with as much valor, humanity, and selflessness as the whites." The greatest compliment this white man can give black men is that they are as good as whites. He rewarded the militia with 2 months' pay, even though the mission had just taken a month. Indians pleased him too, and it particularly touched him that they had brought their women and children to meet him after the battle. All this he used in evidence to the crown that, as he wrote, "This same province that formerly gave doubts about its loyalty to the Spanish nation has given its clearest, most solid, and truest proof of its unceasing love and loyalty to its monarch." Next, Galvez took Mobile in 1780 and Pensacola in 1781, and with Pensacola, all of West Florida surrendered. Galvez went on next to the Bahamas, took the Bahamas from Britain for Spain, and was just on the verge of a naval attack on Jamaica, the crown jewel of the British Empire, when peace was signed. Also, at the end of the Battle of Pensacola, the French fleet that had been assisting Spain there was able to go to the West Indies and send other French ships to Yorktown and help win that battle. So by the end of the Revolution, Spain held the formerly British posts along the Gulf of Mexico and on the eastern bank of the Mississippi. Spain's claims stretched from the Pacific to the Flint River in Georgia and from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. You can see on this map the green and pink sides of the Mississippi are Spanish, at least according to Spanish map makers. In the eyes of Spanish officials, they had succeeded in expanding their empire. And for a time, the people of New Orleans and Louisiana were glad for Spanish rule. Trade flowed freely across the Mississippi into now Spanish West Florida. The port of New Orleans had never been busier. Some enslaved men and women who had helped the Spanish war effort or earned money from opportunities during the war were able to emancipate themselves and their loved ones in unprecedentedly large numbers, thousands of people. Indians used Spanish dependence on them to sign mutual assistance treaties where they promised if either was attacked by the United States, they would fight together. Now, of course, we know that Louisiana would become part of the United States in another generation, and that the United States would not prove to be the malleable Quakers of Spanish imagination. But in the 1780s, the people of New Orleans were firmly part of the Spanish Empire, and most of them were glad to be there.